Hey guys, this is one of the weirdest and creepiest collections of stories I've received. You'll see why when we get to it. And also a quick update about my studio. It should finally be finished within the next week or so. Once it's done, there are going to be some pretty big changes to the channel, including a few things I've been working on behind the scenes for a while now. I'm really excited, and I think you're going to notice a huge difference. As always, thank you for being here, and let's get into the stories. I'd worked a stretch of long shifts and hadn't been sleeping much. The place where I worked packaged fish for distribution. It was repetitive and cold and loud. By the time my days off arrived, I usually didn't want to be around anybody. One of my friends owned a cabin out in the woods and had mentioned before that if I ever wanted to get away for a day or two, I could use it. I finally took him up on the offer. My friend used it during hunting season and during the summer. Otherwise, it sat empty. By the time I arrived, I felt like I'd already started relaxing. I looked around the property and texted my friend to let him know I'd made it. He replied saying, "Have fun doing nothing," which was my plan. I kept the windows open for a few hours. There wasn't much cell service, but I had enough to scroll through videos and answer a few messages. The woods around the cabin seemed pretty chill. As evening got closer, I cooked some food and found myself sitting outside again after dark. I heard music. Well, I thought it was music. I couldn't tell where it was coming from. Somebody was having a party somewhere farther out in the woods. There were dirt roads throughout the area and plenty of places people could gather. The sound itself, it didn't sound like country music, rock music, or anything I could recognize. It sounded like a group of voices repeating the same thing over and over. It reminded me of hearing a church service from far away when the wind carries the sound, because it sounded like multiple people speaking together. I sat there listening for a minute. It continued. It felt strange. The voices seemed synchronized in a way that made it difficult to tell whether it was actually a recording or real people. I remember pulling out my phone and checking the time. It was a little after 12. The sound continued for a few minutes. I even stood near the edge of the porch trying to figure out which direction it was coming from. The woods absorbed so much of it that I couldn't tell. Sometimes it seemed farther left. A moment later, something that sounded like gunfire echoed through the area. The first one made me jump. A few seconds later, there were more. I think I heard 3 or 4 altogether. It sure sounded like gunfire. The music or chanting or whatever it was had already been weird. Adding possible gunshots into the mix, man, it was weird. I locked the doors. If people were drinking somewhere nearby and firing guns into the air like idiots, I wanted a locked door between me and them. The strange music eventually faded away. I couldn't hear it anymore. I figured the gathering was ending and everyone was heading home. I spent another hour inside, made another snack, and considered going to bed. Not long after, I heard somebody moving around outside. The cabin had a gravel area around it. It was more than one person. There was no conversation. I walked toward one of the front windows. There were people moving near the edge of the clearing. At least 4. 3 appeared to be men. 1 appeared to be a woman. None of them seemed to be wearing clothes. They were naked. I wondered if they were drunk. Maybe they'd been partying somewhere and were pulling some bizarre stunt. They weren't talking. They weren't interacting with one another, and moved in a way that felt strangely mechanical. It was a weird description. Their arms stayed stiff. Their posture looked unnatural. One of the men turned his head toward the cabin. The movement looked abrupt. The group continued approaching. I realized they were coming toward the front door. I backed away and turned off the lamp nearest me. The cabin became darker. I heard them on the porch. Someone tried the front door handle. I stood frozen in the kitchen area, staring toward the entrance. The lock held. Nobody knocked. Whoever was outside tested the door and stopped. After a few seconds, I slowly moved back toward the window and looked through a narrow gap beside the curtain. All 4 people were standing there. One of the men raised both hands and started making slow motions in the air, like he was tracing shapes with his fingers. The movements were repetitive. Their hands looked dark. The discoloration covered most of his hands and extended up part of his forearms. My immediate thought was blood. That's a serious assumption, and maybe I was wrong. I started paying closer attention to the rest of them. Several appeared to have similar dark stains. The woman had markings on her shoulders and upper chest. One of the men had dark streaks across his stomach. I also noticed tattoos, like painted symbols covering parts of their bodies. The shapes looked geometric, with circles, intersecting lines, and star-like patterns. You know where I'm going with this. I thought more people were approaching. I focused on the tree line and eventually realized there were at least 2 figures standing back there. They were watching. Others were standing silently in the woods, observing whatever this is. Made the situation feel much bigger than I'd thought. The group started moving again. They began slowly circling the cabin. They didn't stay together while doing it. 2 of them would disappear around one side while the others moved around the back. The floor creaked as they walked across parts of the porch. I had no idea where they were standing. I ended up turning off every light inside the cabin and sitting near one of the windows where I could watch. I probably spent close to an hour doing that. I've been around drunk people. I've been around people trying to scare somebody. I've been around hunters, campers, and random weird individuals. People normally talk, they joke around, they argue, they react to things. These people, barely made any sound. Occasionally one would stop and stare toward the cabin for an uncomfortable amount of time. Would continue making those odd hand motions every now and then. I saw the woman tilt her head upward and stand still for what felt like few minutes. I was expecting somebody to start laughing and reveal it was some kind of prank. One of the men came close enough to the side of the cabin that I could see him through a different window. His skin looked dirty, like he'd been outdoors for a long time. There were markings across his chest and shoulders that looked either painted or tattooed. I couldn't tell which. The design reminded me of symbols you'd see in old books or on album covers. The dark stains on his hands were visible. Again, maybe it wasn't blood. But standing there alone in a cabin after hearing strange chanting and possible gunshots earlier, my brain wasn't coming up with many innocent possibilities. I remember opening my messages and typing out a text to my friend that basically said there were some really weird people outside his cabin. The message failed to send few times before eventually going through. He didn't respond. The figures continued wandering around the property. The people farther back in the woods never seemed to leave. It felt unreal. It seemed so completely disconnected from normal life. Earlier, I'd been eating chips and watching a movie. Now I was hiding in the dark while a group of silent, naked strangers wandered around outside. After midnight, the group gradually started moving away from the cabin. The first 2 headed toward the tree line. The others followed. I watched them disappear into the darkness. The figures farther back seemed to join them. Within a couple of minutes, they were gone. I felt nervous for a different reason. I had no way of knowing whether they were gone. The woods were huge. For all I knew, they could still be standing, yards away watching the cabin. I stayed awake. The idea of driving through dark forest roads while exhausted didn't seem much safer. I ended up staying where I was. Around 4 in the morning, my friend replied. His first response was basically asking if I was serious. The signal was trash, but I explained everything I had seen. There had been stories floating around that area for years about people gathering deep in the woods at night. He didn't know who they were. The stories varied depending on who was telling them. My friend didn't have answers. I stayed awake until daylight. As soon as the sun came up, I started looking around outside. The clearing around the cabin showed signs that people had been there. I found footprints, a lot of them. The ground wasn't ideal for preserving prints. There were enough visible impressions to confirm that multiple people had walked around during the night. There were few empty bottles lying nearby, looked old and had no labels. I didn't spend much time examining any of it. I packed my things faster than I'd originally planned. The trip was supposed to last longer than one night. Before leaving, I took a few pictures of the footprints and sent them to my friend. It was some bizarre gathering. Why were they naked, though? What exactly had been happening in the woods before they arrived? There really are groups of people out there doing things like that in remote places where nobody sees them. Whatever they were involved in that night, they didn't seem concerned about being discovered. walked right up to an occupied cabin. Somebody knocked on the front door. My parents had gone out to run errands, and I knew they'd be back before dinner, so I wasn't expecting people. I walked over to the window beside the door so I could see who it was before opening it. A woman was standing on the porch. I had never seen her before. She looked like she was somewhere in her 40s. She looked like someone who might be looking for an address. I opened the door, but kept the screen door closed. She smiled and asked if my mom or dad were home. I told her they weren't. She asked when they would be back. I didn't know. My parents had only said they were going shopping and would be back later. The woman looked past me into the house before asking if I knew where they had gone. Again, I told her I didn't know. She stood there. At the time, I wasn't scared. The conversation was awkward because she kept asking questions and I couldn't help her. She smiled again and said, "Okay, tell them I stopped by." I asked who she was. She hesitated and then said a first name that I don't remember. It meant nothing to me. She turned around and walked down the driveway. I watched her leave because I thought she might get into a car parked nearby, but she kept walking down the street until I lost sight of her. When my parents got home, I told them about her. I described her as best I could. Neither of my parents recognized the description. My dad asked if she said what she wanted. I told him she only asked questions about whether they were home and when they would be back. He said it was somebody trying to sell something. A few days later, I was at a friend's house after school. His parents had ordered pizza, and a few of us were playing video games in his basement. I stayed longer because we got caught up playing multiplayer games and completely lost track of time. The walk home wasn't far. I was carrying a backpack and cutting through a side street that connected two neighborhoods. There were houses on both sides, and people were outside doing things. About halfway home, a car slowed down next to me. I assumed the driver was asking for directions, because the roads around our area could be confusing if you weren't familiar with them. The passenger side window rolled down. The same woman from my porch was sitting in the passenger seat. I recognized her. She smiled. "Hey," she said. "You remember me?" I nodded because I did. She pointed ahead and said she was driving nearby and recognized me from the other day. There was a man driving the car. He looked older than her. He had short hair and barely said anything during the conversation. The woman asked where I was going. I told her I was heading home. She said they could give me a ride. I told her it was okay because I wasn't far away. She laughed and said, "Come on, it's hot outside." She talked like somebody's aunt. The man spoke and said, "Hop in. We'll have you home in 2 minutes." For one thing, they weren't family friends. If they were, my parents would have recognized her. For another, I had only spoken to her once. I told them again that I was fine walking. The woman pushed a little harder. She asked where exactly I lived. That was a weird thing to ask because she already knew. The man looked over at me for the first time and smiled. I thought it looked forced. I took a step back from the car and said my house was close. The woman stared at me. "Okay," she said. "Be careful." The window rolled up and they drove away. I stood there watching until they turned at the next intersection. When I got home, I told my parents. That felt very different from the first one. My mom wanted to know if it was definitely the same woman. My dad wanted to know why she was talking to me from a car. I explained everything. The offer to drive me home. The questions. The man. The way they kept trying to convince me. Dad told me if I ever saw those people again, I wasn't supposed to go near them. Said if anyone I didn't know ever offered me a ride, the answer was always no. For the next couple of weeks, nothing big happened. School, homework, friends, trips to the grocery store. One afternoon, my parents had to leave for a few hours. My dad had an appointment and my mom went with him. I had stayed home because I wasn't feeling great. I felt tired and wanted to sit around watching TV. I watched cartoons. During the afternoon, somebody knocked on the front door. Visitors were relatively uncommon during weekdays. I looked out. The woman was standing there. I thought she knew my parents after all, and there had been some misunderstanding. She wasn't alone. The man from the car was standing a few feet behind her near the steps. I didn't open the door. The woman smiled when she saw me through the glass. She motioned for me to come closer. I stayed where I was. She knocked again. I could barely hear her through the door, but she seemed to be saying something about needing help. I shook my head. She pointed down toward the porch as if she had dropped something. I didn't move. I noticed something odd. There was a smell, seemed to be strongest around them. It was something, not gasoline or paint thinner, but sharp and unpleasant. Through the closed door I could smell it. The man hadn't said anything yet. He was standing there watching me. I stepped away from the window. A few seconds later, the man walked up to the door. The way he moved changed the entire situation. He reached for the handle and started trying it. He rattled it a few times. The woman stopped talking and looked up and down the street. She was watching the street, like she was checking whether anybody was around. I backed away and grabbed the house phone from the kitchen wall. My mom told me to lock myself in my room and stay on the phone. I heard a loud bang from somewhere on the side of the house, a side entrance we used. My mother was still talking, but I couldn't focus on what she was saying because another bang followed a few seconds later. I ran down the hallway toward my bedroom while holding the phone against my ear. The entire time I could still smell that strange chemical odor drifting through the house, and that was somehow one of the most unsettling parts because I couldn't understand where it was coming from or how it was getting inside. The smell seemed stronger than before, like someone had spilled something nearby. I locked my bedroom door and sat on the floor while my mom stayed on the phone. I could hear panic in her voice. She was telling me they were already on the way and to stay away from the windows. Every few seconds she asked where I was and whether I could still hear them outside. The banging went on. The side door wasn't very strong compared to the front entrance. It was mostly used when my dad worked in the yard, and if they managed to force it open, there would be nothing stopping them from getting inside. I heard footsteps moving around outside the house. It sounded like they were walking quickly from one side to the other. I couldn't see anything from my room because I stayed away from the windows exactly like my mom told me to. That was the smartest thing I did. As a kid, I was curious enough that I normally would have looked outside, but I was scared enough that day that I didn't even consider it. The smell was still there. That's one detail I never forgot. Years later, I can remember it better than I can remember what those people were wearing. It wasn't a natural smell. It smelled industrial, sharp, artificial. Every time I caught another whiff of it, my stomach turned a little. My dad got on the phone. I could hear road noise in the background. He told me they were only a few minutes away and asked if I could still hear the people outside. I told him I wasn't sure. He told me not to move until he got there. I stayed where I was. A few minutes later, I heard a car pull into the driveway. My parents were yelling my name before they even reached the front door. I unlocked my bedroom and ran out to meet them. The first thing both of them noticed was the smell. Neither of them asked about it beforehand. Neither of them knew I had smelled it too. My mom asked, "What is that?" before I even brought it up. The odor was faint by then, but present near the front of the house. Dad came back inside looking concerned. A short time later, the police arrived. I spent most of the time sitting with my parents while they talked. They spent time near the front porch. They found something. Years later, after I was older, my parents explained more of it to me. Apparently, there was some kind of chemical substance on part of the porch near the entrance. Like something had been spilled or like sprayed from a small container. It was something that could potentially cause a person to lose consciousness or become severely disoriented if exposed under the right circumstances. Fortunately, there wasn't much of it. From what my parents understood, it looked like whoever had put it there either used a very small amount or didn't get a chance to do whatever they intended. They kept details away from me because I was a kid. I wasn't allowed to walk home alone. Doors stayed locked all the time. We never saw those people again. It was like they disappeared after that day. I expected the police would eventually identify them. As a kid, that's how I thought things worked. I assumed somebody would recognize them, or a neighbor's camera would capture a license plate or something, would eventually lead somewhere. But nothing happened. The years passed. None of us ever understood what those people wanted. The obvious answer seemed simple. They were trying to kidnap me. How much effort they put into finding opportunities when I was alone. The woman came to the house and checked whether my parents were home. It was planned. I don't know how they knew my parents weren't home that afternoon. Maybe they were watching the house. They had been checking periodically. The smell, it was present during every part of the final encounter. It seemed to be coming from them, from their clothing, or from whatever they had brought with them. Even my parents noticed it after arriving. Mom said it was one of the reasons the entire situation frightened her so much. She couldn't identify what she was smelling, but she knew it wasn't good. When you're an adult, you start realizing how much worse they could have been. She seemed friendly, normal, approachable. If our paths had crossed under slightly different circumstances, I would have trusted them. I was young enough to believe adults generally meant well. Whatever their plan was, it ended when they realized I wasn't opening that door. My friend and I spent a lot of time in the woods behind our neighborhood when we were teenagers. We were at that age where you had enough freedom to disappear for most of the day, as long as your parents generally knew where you were. The woods were kind of our default place whenever we were bored. There were trails people used for hiking, but there were also huge sections that didn't really have any paths. If you spent enough time out there, you eventually started recognizing landmarks the same way you recognize streets in a town. That period of my life was good. School, video games, hanging out with friends, trying to avoid homework whenever possible. My friend lived only a few streets away from me, so we saw each other constantly. We would leave one of our houses in the morning and just wander around until dinner. The woods were interesting because there was always something random back there. People dumped things out there. Because of that, finding unusual objects wasn't really a big thing. One afternoon, we ended up farther into the forest. While we were talking about something completely unrelated, I think it might have been a video game coming out later that year, I saw what looked like a pile of clothing lying on the ground ahead of us. I barely paid attention to it. As we got closer, it became obvious it wasn't random garbage. It looked like actual clothes stacked together. A shirt, a pair of jeans, some other items. It was strange seeing clothing that far into the woods. We were teenagers. We weren't wondering why clothes were sitting in the middle of nowhere. We thought it was weird. We had only been standing there for like 15 to 20 seconds when a voice behind us asked what we were doing. Neither of us had heard anybody approaching. We both turned around. A shirtless man was standing few yards away between the trees. His skin looked grimy. I told him we were just hanging out. My friend basically said the same thing. The man looked past us toward the pile of clothes. I think what bothered me was how long he took to respond to simple questions. Every exchange had these awkward pauses where he would just stare. He asked whether we had touched the clothes. We told him no. He walked past us without another word, bent down, picked up the pile, and started carrying it away. I was looking at my friend because neither of us understood what had just happened. The man disappeared through the trees. That was it. We figured the clothes belonged to him. He had left them there earlier for some reason. We stayed in the woods for another hour or so. While we were making our way back toward the neighborhood, my friend saw someone walking through the trees off to our right. When I looked over, I recognized the man. He was wearing different clothes than before. I remember a dark-colored shirt. He seemed to be moving in the same direction we were. Every time we'd catch sight of him, he'd be somewhere off between the trees. My friend said, "Is that the same guy?" I told him I thought so. The woods were huge. There was no reason for him to keep appearing near us over and over. He was standing still. We decided to leave. We weren't even sure why we were nervous. The guy hadn't threatened us. We ended up jogging for part of the way back. The trees blocked visibility constantly, so there was no way to know where he was. Once you're back somewhere familiar, it felt less serious. We went to my friend's house and spent the rest of the afternoon there. His bedroom was upstairs and had a window facing the woods. We were sitting near that window later in the day talking. Somebody walking along the tree line. I asked my friend to come look. The same man was standing near the woods behind the property, looking toward the houses. The woods stretched behind multiple properties. Why was he there? My friend went downstairs and told his parents. His dad checked the backyard and didn't find him. For the rest of the evening, they treated it like some strange local guy wandering around. I tried doing the same, but things didn't end there. A few days passed after that. Nothing happened during that time. We weren't sitting around convinced some dangerous person was following us. Around that time, my parents were both working. I was home alone, often during the afternoons, and sometimes my friend would come over. The day, my parents were out for a few hours. I think one of them was working late, and the other was helping a relative with something. Whatever it was, they weren't expected back until evening. My friend came over after lunch. We spent most of the afternoon doing what we usually did back then. I went into the kitchen to grab something to drink. While I was standing there, I heard sounds in the house. I thought that my friend had gotten up. The house wasn't very large, so you can hear people moving around pretty easily. I didn't think much about it. A minute later, my friend walked into the kitchen from the opposite direction. I remember asking if he had been upstairs. He said no. I told him I thought I heard someone walking around. We went back to what we were doing. A little while later, we both heard sounds. This time, there wasn't much room for confusion. It sounded like a door closing somewhere upstairs. We both looked toward the staircase at the same time. I asked if one of my parents had come home early. Neither of us had heard a vehicle pull into the driveway. Normally we would have. I got up and checked the front window. No sign that anyone had arrived. My friend said there was a ghost upstairs. That was about the level of seriousness we were treating the situation with at that point. We decided to go upstairs and check. The hallway was empty. Bedroom and bathroom doors were open. We started heading back downstairs. While we were standing near the top of the staircase, another sound came from somewhere inside the house. A heavy object had been moved. My friend stopped and looked at me. The sound hadn't come from outside. We started checking rooms one at a time. The sound seemed to be coming from downstairs now. I started feeling nervous. Something didn't make sense anymore. We headed downstairs carefully. The television was still playing where we'd left it. Then my friend, he pointed. Some man was standing near the hallway. I recognized him. The man from the woods. I hadn't seen him in several days, but there was no doubt it was him. His hands, they looked coated in some kind of dark substance. I can compare it to used motor oil. Even now I'm not sure what it was. And marks on his arms. They looked like burns, damaged skin. The man was looking at us. His expression was hard to describe. He started talking. That bothered me for years. His voice sounded really creepy, like two different people were taking turns speaking. I don't know if that's what was happening or if panic was affecting the way I remember it. I only know what it sounded like to me. The words themselves barely made sense. He kept asking questions and answering them himself. His speech jumped from one topic to another. A few times he addressed us directly. He was talking to somebody who wasn't there. My friend said, "That's him," as if there were any chance I hadn't recognized him. We ran out the front door. I couldn't tell whether the man was following us or not. A relative of mine lived close enough that we could reach their house on foot. Trying to explain what happened was harder than I expected. A strange man from the woods had somehow gotten inside my house. They called the police, and they started heading toward my house. My friend and I mostly sat there trying to calm down. The adrenaline crash was awful, my hands shaking. I had left everything at my house. We were told that nobody could find the man. He was gone. By the time anyone started looking for him, he had plenty of time to leave. As strange as the man's voice sounded, and as unsettling as his behavior was, I think he was probably a real person dealing with issues I didn't understand as a teenager. What scares me is how many chances we had to encounter him before things escalated. Every time, there was a part of me that knew something wasn't right. It wasn't until he was standing inside my house that the reality of the situation hit me. I've had scarier moments in the sense that I've been in accidents and emergencies since then. Life gives you all kinds of experiences as you get older. But I've never had another experience that left me with so many unanswered questions. Who was he? Why was he carrying those clothes in the woods? What was on his hands? Why was he talking the way he was? We still bring it up whenever we happen to talk about things that happened when we were younger. Nobody saw him again. Part of my brain still connects those woods with that period of my life. Of everything that happened back then, that's the one thing I never forgot.